Welcome to part 27 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. Now that we have our tile JSON data in Phaser, we'll set up collision layers to define where the player and enemies can and cannot go. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and add collision handling. Now that we've added our base logic for parsing our tile JSON file and grabbing our objects from our tile map in Phaser, we're going to pause working with our objects and start working on updating our game to have things like our collision and being able to have our player move through our rooms. We'll come back to our objects in our next section where we actually add the objects to each of our rooms. So first, we'll focus on our collision layer. So let's come back to our game scene. Let's come up to our create level method. So now to add a collision layer to our game, we need to use our tile JSON data. So in our tile map that we create in Phaser, so far we've been working with our object layers. And we want to do a similar thing for our layers array where we find our layer for our collisions by its name, and then we use that layer to create what's called a tile map layer. The tile map layer is an object that gets added to our game that has all of the tiles that exist on that layer, and then we can use that to check for collisions between that layer and our other game objects. And so to add that code after we create our map, let's make a new variable. We're going to call this collision layer. We're going to set that equal to our map. We'll do create layer. So now when we create this layer, we need to provide our ID or our name of our layer. And so we'll do our tiled layer names, and we want to do collision. Next, we need to provide an array of our tile sets that was used when we created this layer. By providing these tile sets, it allows us to render out that layer into our game. For now, we're just going to do an empty array. Then next, we need to provide our X and Y position of where we want to create this layer in our game. For this, we're going to use our origin, so it's placed in the same location of where we have our background images starting in our game. So after we create our layer, we're just going to add in a safeguard to make sure this was actually created. So when you call create layer, if you provide an invalid layer name that's not found, this method's going to return null. And so we're going to do if our collision layer is equal to null, we're going to log a message. And so we're just going to do console.log. We'll say encountered error while creating collision layer using data from tiled. And then we'll just add a return statement so we don't process the rest of our method. So now to test our changes, let's do console.log, and we're going to log out our collision layer. Now if we save, if we come back into our browser, we should now see a new object being logged, and it's going to be our tile map layer. And it's going to have all of our properties for this layer. Now that we have our collision layer, we can register a collider between our player's physics body and this tile map layer, and then that way our player won't be able to leave our room. To do this, we'll need to store our collision layer as a property on our class, and so we'll do this. Let's do our collision layer. We'll set it equal to our collision layer. Let's add this property to our class. Let's come to the top of our class. We'll add in our collision layer. So now for our type, this is going to be a phaser, a tile maps tile layer. Now down in our create method, after we call create level, we're also going to add a safeguard here to make sure this is defined. So we'll do if this.collision layer is equal to undefined. Then we want to do a warning message to our console. So we do console.warn, and we'll do missing required collision layers for game. And then we'll return early. And so similar to what we do for our input, this is key for our game functioning properly. And so returning early is fine since our game will be in a broken state. Now that we have our collision layer, we can add a new collider to have our player collide with our level. So let's come down to our register colliders method. At the bottom of our method, let's add in a new collider. So after we do our pots, we'll do this.physics, we'll do add, let's do a collider, and now we'll do this.player, and we'll do our collision layer. Alright, so if we save and refresh our browser, if we try having our player move through our level, we'll see that our collisions aren't working properly. And so to help debug this, we're going to add in our tile set that was used to create our collision layer so we'll be able to see it in our game. To do this, let's come back down to our create level method. Before we create our collision layer, instead of passing in an empty array, we need to pass in our tile set that was used to create this layer and tiled. To do that, we'll make a new variable. We're going to call this collision tiles. We're going to reference our map, and then we'll do add tile set image. For this, we provide the name of our tile set that was used in tiled, and so this will be our tiled tile set names collision. Now we need to provide our asset key of that same asset. And so this will be our asset keys, and it's going to be our collisions asset. We'll also add in a safe check here. And so let's just copy this code here. We'll paste it. And so when we call add tile set image, this will also return null. And so we'll do collision tiles if it's set to null. And for our console log, we'll say encountered error while creating our collision tiles from tiled. Now that we have our collision tiles, we'll update our array to pass that in. So now when our scene refreshes, we should see our red box that represents our collision tiles for our player in this room. So now for our collisions to work properly, we need to tell Phaser for our tile map which of these tiles we want to check for collisions with. To do that, we can use the ID of our texture for the tile and pass that to Phaser, and then it's going to enable collisions for that tile type and our game object we provided. And so for our collision layers, if we use a variety of tile types, we need the ID of all of those tiles in order for this to work properly. And so to see a reference of what I'm referring to, if we open up our dungeon_1 JSON file, at the bottom of our JSON file, we have this tile sets array. This tile sets array has an array of tile sets that make up our tiled level. This is going to refer to the tile set images or sprite sheets that we used, and it's going to assign a unique identifier for where the tile starts when we process that data in tiled. And it's going to be called this first GID. And so when we load in the sprite sheet, it's going to assign a unique identifier to each of those frames of that sprite sheet when we load it in tiled. And so if this sprite sheet had multiple images, it would start at 1432, then go to 1433, 1434, and so on. Similarly, for our tile set here, for our dungeon assets, we start at 1, and then for each of our frames, we go up by 1. And so it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we would see all of these tile set frames referenced in our JSON file here. And so, since we only used a single frame for our collision layer, we just need to provide this single ID to Phaser. If we used multiple frames, we would need to provide all of those IDs to Phaser. So now to pass that information, let's go up to where we create our collisions, and before we add in our collider, this is what we'll call that code. So we'll do this, we need to do our collision layer, we're going to do set collision, and now when we call set collision, we can provide an array of our tile indexes that we want to use. And so for this array, we'll just do this, we'll do our collision layer, we'll do our tile set, and we're going to grab our first element from that object, and we'll call our first GID. So before we do this, let's log out our collision layer. And now in our browser, we should see our tile map layer being logged. And if we go down to our tile set property, we'll see this is an array of tile sets that are used for this layer. Since we only use the one tile set, we just have our collision, and we can rely just on that first GID. And so how this first GID is used, if we go into our called tiles array, we'll see this is an array of all our tiles that make up our tile map layer. And for each of these tiles, there's going to be an index. This index refers to that first GID. And for all of our tiles that are created here, we'll see it has that same index. And so if we looked at a different layer that had multiple tiles being used, we would see that each of their indexes would be different. All right, so back in our code, now that we've called set collision and we've provided an array of those IDs, now in our game, we should be able to have our player move, and once it collides with our tile map layer, we'll see our player's not actually able to move through it. But now if we come down to our door where our red tiles are missing, we'll see that our player can transition to our next room. Nice. So one last thing we'll do for our collision layer is we're going to modify some of our properties on our object. We're going to update our depth property so this object will appear on top of all of our other game objects. So after we assign our collision layer to our property, we'll do this, we'll do our collision layer. Let's call set depth, and we're going to set this to be 2. So now, when we create our game objects in our scene, our collision layer should always appear on top of them. Next, we're going to make our alpha configurable on our object so then that way we can hide this in our final game. To do that, we're going to call set alpha, and now we'll make a new config property, and we're going to call this debug collision alpha. So now if we open up our config file, let's add that at the top of our file. So we'll do export, we'll do const debug collision alpha. We're going to set that to be 1. Now if we come back to our game scene, let's update to have our import. All right, so after we save, when our browser refreshes, we'll see since we updated our alpha to be 1, our layer is much more visible to our player. While our testing, let's change this to 0.6. So now when we save, it'll be a little more transparent like it was before. And now when we don't want to see it while we're testing, if we set it to 0, it'll be hidden to our player. So now that we've created our collision layer for our player, we want to do the same thing for our enemies. That way our enemies will stay within our room. So after we create our collision layer, let's make a new object. We're going to call this enemy collision layer. For that, we'll do map, we'll do create layer. We'll reference our tile layer names. We'll do our enemy collision layer. We'll pass in our collision tiles. And we'll also do 0, 0 for our position. Now we'll do the same thing. We'll make sure that this isn't null. So let's paste in that code. We'll update our reference. And now for our log line, we're just going to say creating enemy collision layer. So now after we create our enemy collision layer, we'll want to store that in a property on our class. So let's copy these 2 lines of code here. We'll paste them. And so we'll do enemy collision layer. Let's add that property to our class. So we'll come up to the top of our file. Let's do enemy collision layer. For our type, we'll do a phaser tile map layer. And so while we're up here, let's update our create method. And so we'll just update our safeguard. We'll say if our enemy collision layer is undefined, then we'll log out our warning message. Let's come back down to our code. So then for our enemy collision layer, instead of calling set alpha, we're just going to do set visible. And we're going to set this to be true, so we make sure it renders. Now if we save, let's go over to our config. Let's update our collision alpha to be 0 for our player. So now when we save, when our browser refreshes, we'll see we have this red rectangle box, and this is our enemy collision layer to keep our enemies within our room. So I'm going to revert the change to our alpha. We'll come back to our game scene. Since we made sure our collision layer is showing where we want it to be, let's set this to be false. Now we need to create a collider between our enemies and this collision layer. So now if we come up to our register colliders method, let's copy these 2 lines of code here. We'll do the same thing for our enemies. So now we'll do our enemy collision layer. We'll want to reference our enemy collision layer. We'll grab that tile set and we'll do our first GID. Now for our collider, we want to register this between our enemies. And so we'll do this, our enemy group, and our enemy collision layer. So now when we refresh, we should see right away that our wisp is now bouncing around our room and it's colliding with our enemy collision layer. The same thing should happen for our spider once it encounters our wall. Nice. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.